Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you. One of the silver linings in this whole pandemic has been the ability to connect with scholars around the world in the same time in ways that were never possible when we were always trying to do it by flying around the world. So I'm really happy to be here and appreciate the opportunity. I'm going to share my screen real quick. What I also appreciate the opportunity to present something very, very new. This will be the first time really talking about this project publicly. It's also an opportunity to talk about something that could really use your feedback. This is a research design. So we are about ready to field the first version of the study. And so we can still fix things before we field it. This is work that comes out of a research lab at Emory University that links together social scientists, scholars of law, scholar film studies with postdoctoral students, PhD students, and undergraduate students. So Adiela Vasquez is an undergraduate student at Emory who sort of began this idea, and what students do is pitch idea projects, and then we work together with them to kind of turn them into things that can be sort of moved along in the social science context. So that's what the project's about. So let me set the context for you. This is a screenshot of a website from the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is a human rights organization primarily operating in the United States. And here they're talking on the webpage about a series of programs supporting asylum seekers in the United States. And the key things to look at are here. So if you click on this part of the screen, you would learn stories from asylum seekers speaking in their own voice about their experiences. And the second thing to notice is this right here. So what they'll do is contextualize the stories with statistics that suggest the scale of the problem that the group is working on. So it's a combination of narrative appeal with statistics. It's sort of well known that groups can be more successful in their campaigns to seek support through telling of stories than of simply just describing a problem. But here you'll note it's really common to contextualize the story with statistics. And this isn't just SPLC. This is, Doctors Without Borders, and you'll note very similar structure. They're going to tell you stories about refugees, and they'll embed it with a statistic like 70.8 million people are forced from their home around the world. So let me just show you a graphic really quickly and walk you through what's happening here. So this was a study conducted in 2006, published in 2007, where they were telling subjects in an experiment information about victims of a human rights atrocity. And the first bar here is what this is on the y-axis is just the amount of money these individuals are willing to donate to support the cause of supporting victims or people like the victims in the study they learned about. And so this is the amount, so the average they were willing to contribute when they just learned some general statistical information about people subject to the atrocity. When they told that story with respect to an individual person, the amount of money jumped pretty significantly. The key thing is when they embedded the individual story in the broader statistical context of the problem, the support level dropped pretty significantly. So the puzzle is, what we want to think about is like, why does combining narrative appeal with statistics undermine the effect of the narrative appeal? Okay, because it's groups want to tell stories, but they also want to communicate that the story isn't just a story, it's a broader one. Yet it would seem that when they do that, they undermine the power of the story. So the goal of our paper then is to investigate two possible explanations for these findings in the context of an immigration appeal to provide, and this is the law part of the story for the talk. The appeal is to, or the Human Rights Campaign is to provide free legal representation to individuals seeking asylum in the United States. And I'll talk a little bit about the asylum structure in the US, just to give you a sense of why this is such an important appeal that is an ongoing one, and the subject of litigation around the United States at the moment. Okay, so just generally speaking, the paper is, as I say, we're going to think about these two theoretical mechanisms, which I'll talk to you about. It's applied to this immigration law appeal, so I'll talk to you a little bit about how that works, and the study will be embedded in a particular kind of story about a human rights group, which is called the Human Rights Initiative. And this is we do work with human rights groups in our community. This design uses a fictitious group, and there's some research design reasons for that. But all people that take part in the study will learn that this group is very similar to existing groups, and the campaign is very similar to existing campaigns, and they'll get information which will allow them to contribute to those campaigns directly in the real world if they wish. And then I'll talk a little bit about the experimental design, which is relatively straightforward, I hope. We'll be doing a pilot study with a sample from Amazon's Mechanical Turk platform, but then eventually doing a nationally representative sample of US adults. That's the plan for this particular paper. Okay, so let me just give you a little bit of asylum background. This is going to be a very short legal contextualization piece of this talk. But it's just the amount of law that I think you would need if you knew nothing about how asylum law works in the United States, just to understand why this is an important question that these groups are working on. So the U.S. Refugee Act of 1980 incorporates the International Refugee Framework and the 51 Refugee Convention and its 1967 protocol. So this is embedded in U.S. federal statute. And importantly, there's two pathways for asylum. The first is affirmative asylum. So a person who is not currently in the process of a removal proceeding, which is another way of saying a deportation proceeding, can apply through the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service. Okay, so that's one piece. The piece that we're really focusing on is defensive asylum. So these are individuals who are in the process of being removed from the United States. They can apply for asylum directly with an immigration judge. So the courts in the US system that manage immigration processes, first and foremost, are actually not courts at all. They're administrative courts effectively, but they're a piece of the Department of Justice. And the highest judge in this system is actually the Attorney General. There are ways of appealing decisions from immigration court outward to the federal judiciary of the United States. But the primary place in which these cases happen or are managed are inside the Department of Justice. So this defensive asylum piece is kind of like really the subject of what we're thinking about. I'll just give you a little bit of background. So this is from 2017, 2019, again, so we're in the Trump administration. To give you a sense of the scale of individuals who are making defensive asylum claims. So 2 years ago, I guess, the number was about 210,000 people. And here you get a sense of the countries from which these individuals are coming in terms of when they're making the claims. This is ranked. This list is ranked by the 2019 data. So to be clear about it, the largest number of claims are coming from people who are coming from Guatemala, and next from Honduras, and then from Mexico and El Salvador, okay? To give you a sense of over time, this are the sort of annual grants of both affirmative and defensive asylum claims from 1990 down here to, again, 2019. And so the key sort of general thing to think about is the rates of granting asylum are higher for the affirmative than the defensive asylum claims, but they hover somewhere at a low down here. You can see it's been trending upward, but a low of somewhere around 3.5% to more or less a little bit under 20%. Okay, so that's just a little bit of background. The next slide is sort of the key thing. So this is, what you're looking at now is a plot of the defensive asylum grant rates. So the proportion of of cases in which an immigration judge granted asylum by immigration court in the United States. So the immigration, this is the Arlington, for example, the Arlington, Virginia Immigration Court, and the grant rate is somewhere around 38%. The key thing you want to see is like there's tremendous variation in these courts. And there are different populations that appear in these courts, for sure. For example, the people who appear in immigration court along the United States southern border with Mexico are more commonly people who have just crossed the river, whereas people who might appear in Atlanta tend to have been in the country for a little bit longer. But once you account for the characteristics of the people, this variation in these grant rates tend to be really strongly driven by many features, including features of the immigration judge. And I just want to point out there, that's Atlanta, where we are. And this is an example of an immigration court that is described as effectively like a no asylum zone, right? So the grant rates for asylum claims in the Atlanta Immigration Court hover somewhere around 3 or 4%. So that's not completely uncommon. You can see Omaha, Nebraska is also really low. The point is there's tremendous variation. So one of the reasons people think about this is the combination of the judges that are sitting on these courts and the following piece of information, which is in the US Code, in immigration court, respondents, that's the name of individuals who are being subject to removal procedures, respondent aliens have the right to be represented by legal counsel, but they don't have the right to free legal counsel. And so there's tremendous variation in the extent to which individuals are represented. And that too seems to be pretty strongly related to whether they receive asylum. And a whole host of other outcomes in immigration court, right? Not surprisingly, not having a lawyer in a very complicated piece of law, often carried out in a completely foreign language. And when the respondent appears in many of these cases via what we're doing right now, video teleconferencing, and that happened long before the pandemic. This is a hard environment to navigate without a lawyer. Okay, so that's sort of the background for, and groups, what groups are doing is they're advocating for providing people with free legal counsel, right? That's the human rights campaign that we want to be thinking about. The question is like, why is it when, we're interested in, as a practical matter, what should the message be, right? And there's a desire to combine statistics and stories. And so we want to think about two possible theoretical mechanisms that could explain why when you combine this information, you don't have the same effect of the story that you thought you would. By the way, if there are questions and are rolling in, I'm not watching the chat, you can just interrupt me and I'm happy to respond. I don't know, I don't want to violate your rules, but you just feel free to let me know. So these two ideas, one is called mixed rhetorical appeals and the other is psychic numbing. And I'll note this is like new research for me. These are new literatures. I'm not a political psychologist. Ariela Vasquez really got into this stuff and dragged me into it. And so I'm engaged in this stuff at the moment. So I'm going to do my best to describe to you how these arguments work. So the first idea is that what's happening is you're mixing the sort of rhetorical structure of an argument, okay? And the easiest way to think about this is to start with what it would look like to mix the rhetorical argument of a logical argument. And specifically, the idea is that the mixing creates an inconsistency in the argument, right? So we'll start with like the simple, this is just to get, if nothing else, I apologize if this is super pedantic. This is just in part me trying to get my head around what they're saying, because there's a bunch of ways in which you could be inconsistent. So here's an argument, nobody goes there anymore, the food is terrible, right? And what that really looks like logically is people do not visit food with restaurants with bad food. The food at restaurant A is bad, therefore people do not visit restaurant A. So there's your, true premises, valid conclusion, valid argument, and it's sound. These premises are true, okay? So no inconsistency here. Now consider this one, right? So nobody goes there anymore, it's too crowded. Right? So this is like this apocryphal, I think, quote from a baseball player from years ago who said a lot of things like this. So the logical structure of it is people don't visit restaurants when they're crowded. Restaurant A is crowded with people, therefore people do not visit restaurant A. So this is like the canonical example of an inconsistent argument because premises 1 and 2 don't fit. It's valid. You can conclude anything from them because they're inconsistent with each other, but it's unsound. They can't, these are not true. They couldn't be true simultaneously, right? So this is like what it would look like to be illogical, okay? That's not exactly what they're saying, but this sort of sets the frame for what they're talking about. The idea is you can be inconsistent in arguments that are not about logic, right? They're appeals to emotion. So here's an example, I think, of what this literature means by a consistent appeal to hope. We should keep our bars closed. We are so close to herd immunity. The vaccines are very effective and many people are receiving them. Soon we will have our lives back, right? That's a consistent appeal to hope. Here's what I believe they mean by an inconsistent appeal to hope. So, 1 and 2 the same way in this argument. And then 3, right after we've said the vaccines are very effective. And you can imagine hearing people, this is like a conversational argument, right? We have to remember that the past government failed us, failed the most vulnerable, failed us all. The past president didn't care about anything, but whatever, that's water under the bridge now, right? You just sort of get off track because you forget, like you're supposed to be talking about hope, but now you're triggering like anger and frustration, and the mixing of like anger and frustration with hope creates an inconsistency of emotion. So the kind of inconsistency we're dealing with here looks like this. Alejandro is a good person who confronted a threat to his life and his family's well-being. He made the difficult choice to leave his home and seek safety in the United States, and there are well over 100,000 people like Alejandro. Okay, so what's inconsistent about this? It's not an illogical argument. It's not the mixing of 2 different types of emotion. It's the mixing of 2 different frames. One of them, right, is about the personal narrative, which psychologists will argue will tap into like an emotion like empathy. And the other is a statistical frame for the argument, which triggers analytical reasoning. So the idea is, in short, narrative appeals, stories create emotional frames. They're persuasive when they're consistently appealing to the same emotion. When you add statistics, you create an analytical frame which is inconsistent with the frame of triggering empathy. It's starting to make you think about exactly what's happening here and how could we fix it, rather than worrying about the particular person. And that kind of inconsistency undermines the emotional appeal. So that's one idea. Okay, so I apologize a lot on that piece, but I think I've been trying to work through exactly how to think through theoretically what the argument is. That's my best guess at this point. Okay, the second possible mechanism comes in 2 variants, and it's called psychic numbing. The basic idea is that when you tell people statistical information, the way that you describe the statistics powerfully influences empathy in 1 of 2 ways. So one possible mechanism is this. If you think about the y-axis, it's like the value of to the person you're telling the story, okay, of the life of the person that the story is about. And then the x-axis is like the number of victims of this atrocity that you tell them about. And the idea from this literature is that there's something called a compassion collapse. That is, you tell them that the number of people subject to this atrocity goes up, their compassion for any one of these people goes down. They get sort of, the logic is they get kind of numbed to the problem, overwhelmed by it. It's a mixing of emotions and analytics, kind of almost like the mixed appeal things that just make them give up. There's nothing really to do. Whereas if you told them it was 3 or 4, tell them it's 1 million people, it's one thing. If you tell it's 3 or 4, it's another. So the second variant of this actually isn't about numbers, it's about proportions. The idea is as the proportion of victims relative to the possible set of victims increase, the value of any life goes up. So if you tell someone about 300 children in a village of 1,000, that will have a much stronger effect on people's compassion or empathy than if you talk to them about 300 children in a city of 5 million. That's a basic idea. And almost every time that you give a statistic, you're telling someone something about a very small proportion in almost all of these big human rights campaigns. So the basic idea here then is adding statistical information undermines the positive effect of narrative, because either the campaigns report very large numbers or they report numbers that suggest a small proportion of victims relative to the total population who were at risk. So for us, the key kind of empirical challenges we want to tease out, we want to set up a design that can allow us to ask which of these two mechanisms is likely to be the right one. One is probably a little bit easier to solve as a practical matter than the other, but we're going to try to figure out which it might be. So we're going to need to tell the folks in our experiment a credible story about a person seeking asylum that doesn't reveal a particular individual's situation. Okay. We want to manipulate statistical information about the country of origin context to explain the rationale for the asylum seeking, right? So what's going on in the country, your country of origin, that's causing you to leave? We need to manipulate information about that. But we have to do that without deception, which is to say, like, we're not going to lie to anyone about the actual problem in the country we're talking about, which is a real country and a salient country in the context of our study, which is going to be subject to the United States. The country we're talking about is a salient country in the US, and the information we want to give, we want it to be truthful. We don't want to have to debrief them. We think it's important to be forthright on this particular matter. So how are we going to manipulate the statistical information is the design challenge. Now, I'll show you in a minute. I have a slide on empirical implications. It's got a wall of words. I've got a figure that summarizes what we're trying to get at, which if you just bear with me, we can maybe avoid the words, but I can come back to it if you have questions. So here's the wall of words. Let me return to this later, okay? So here's the design summary. It's relatively simple. There are 5 arms. There's a control group and then 4 treatment groups, okay? This group is going to hear some information about asylum in the United States and the legal process, and they're going to learn things like you don't get access to free legal counsel, okay? And it's really complicated, and respondents appear by video, and yet they don't have a lawyer, right? This group is going to hear that, but they're also going to get a personal story. This is this thing. So this is like just telling you this is all the stuff you'd see in the experiment. And this is just telling you like which pieces of information the subjects are going to see. So they're going to see a story about Alejandro. This group is going to hear about Alejandro, but then they're going to get an info graphic, which is going to talk about the security situation in the country of Mexico, okay? They're going to hear not just information about security, but they're going to get a particular statistic that's supposed to tell them there's a very serious security problem in many parts of the country. And the statistic they're going to hear is a very large number. This group is going to hear basically the same information, but the statistic they're going to hear is going to be small. Okay, like in an absolute scale, it's like the difference between literally 150,000 and 30. Okay, and then this group is going to hear the same information, but instead of large or small numbers, they're going to get treated with a proportion that's very small. That's the basic idea. So let me just show you what it looks like. So this is basically what you'd be looking at if you were in the experiment. This is the logo of the Human Rights Initiative. This is taken from some prior research, which has done this kind of thing. The logo is supposed to look like a plausible logo for a human rights organization. The introduction, again, is just going to tell them, I'll just summarize it. You could read it while I'm talking if you're interested, but it's just giving you background, some of the stuff I told you about asylum. And the key thing here is you're telling people, look, you have to prove in immigration court that this person has a credible fear of returning to their home countries. We excluded the nexus between their credible fear and the reason for the credible, actual, whether or not, for example, their fear is based on their membership in a particular social group or their race or religion. Right? We're not overwhelming them with legal information, but that's a basic idea. Then we tell them, people face obstacles, immigration law is complex, and again, this information about not having a lawyer. And then this is what the control group would see. And then they will go immediately to the outcome questions. The treatment group that hears the story of Alejandro, who's from Chihuahua, and some basic background. The reason for leaving has to do with getting involved with a drug organization or being recruited, basically. So this is not a particular person, Alejandro. This is taken from like a whole series of stories that we put together through reading the stories, but also working with advocacy groups in Atlanta, in California, and at the border in Brownsville, Texas, which is the most eastern border with Mexico. So basically, they're going to learn he's in detention, he's seeking asylum, he's trying to defend himself, but he doesn't have a lawyer and he doesn't really understand how the process works. So that's the story that they'll hear. And then the groups that hear statistics, it'll look something like this. We're still working out the graphical design of it, but they're going to learn that the state of security in Mexico is in question. And this is all truthful statistics. So since 2006, the Mexican government has been involved in a drug war against many cartels. And then these cartels do murder civilians who refuse to help them. According to the Congressional Research Service, roughly, and here's where we'll manipulate the statistic, they're either going to hear 150,000 people have been murdered since 2006. That's the large number. Or they're going to hear 30 people have been murdered each day. Or they're going to hear one person has been murdered each day per 4 million Mexicans. So this is like where the rabbit, I don't know, gets put into the hat. I'm not sure how that works, but the trick here, the design trick is we're changing the units, right? So the total versus the total per day versus the total per day per capita to get at this difference between large, small, and proportion. So that's the idea. And this has some important design implications, but that's the idea. So then everyone will see this thing, which is about the campaign of providing free legal counsel. So they'll learn this is what Human Rights Initiative is doing. And then they'll answer these questions. So this is a behavioral study. Sorry, this is an attitudinal study. We'll ask whether these are taken from existing studies. So whether they're likely to support a campaign, providing asylum seekers with attorneys. And then they also get a chance to add their name to a letter that would be sent to the Attorney General, who again is the head judge in this immigration court system. So these are the two outcomes. The analysis is pretty straightforward. It's effectively comparing means through this little regression model. Each of these dummy variables is just recording the treatment. Like this is the narrative. People got the narrative with the large statistics, the narrative with the small, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Here's the basic empirical implication. So what are we expecting to observe? This is the effect of the treatment conditions relative to the control group, right? If the mixed appeals argument is right, then what you should see is the narrative is particularly strong and the effects of the narrative plus any of the statistical information is weak, but it doesn't matter what kind of statistics you talk them about. Any statistics would create the inconsistency in the argument. If it's the first psychic numbing argument, then you should see this reduction in the effect for the large statistic, but not for the proportion or the small one, okay? And if it's the other one, you should see the reduction when you give them the proportion. So that's basically the key things we're looking for empirically. And if you have other ideas for things that you think we should be looking for, let us know. We're in that stage. We are looking at heterogeneous effects. So for the students who are just starting, what we mean is the effect of the treatment may be different for different people, right? So it's like the effect of the vaccine is stronger for some people than others. This is the effect of these manipulations are stronger for some people. So one of them is numeracy. So among the very highly numerate, it seems pretty likely that you can imagine a person recognizing that's all the same information. Like every treatment group is telling you 150,000 people between 2006 and 2019. You could figure out the numbers if you just thought about it for a second. So that's one idea. The second is we might see the effect strongest among the most empathetic. So we've got a battery of questions to tap into empathy, and then partisanship. I mean, this is a very salient partisan issue in the United States and many countries, right? So here we're going to tap into partisanship and think about whether the effects are strongest among Democrats. Okay, so to sort of conclude here, I just want to point out, the broader implications of this type of analysis, because this, there is a ton of work on this kind of problem in environmental studies. So thinking about how do we talk to people about the consequences of climate change, I think it would be silly not to just remind ourselves that this has really important implications for what we've all been managing in terms of the pandemic. So this is just the BBC News reporting of, our daily tracker of all this information, where we learn that there have been 114 million cases and 5,000 new deaths yesterday, right? And then when we see it presented in graphical form, we see often something like this, which is a graph of over time, the number of new deaths associated with COVID-19. And these numbers are huge, right? This is like the number 14,000 per day around the world, right? So it's the same information again, but like gigantic numbers. So then what they usually do is this thing, you can click this little thing here, this box, and then you can see it on per million. So it seems like, that's a much more manageable number, right? This is too big. This is going to numb people. But the standard solution is click the box and then you get this, right? Which is 1.8 people died per 1 million people yesterday, which is a very small proportion, right? So my sense is that at least if you think about the psychic numbing aspects of this, the two general solutions for providing people statistical information are tapping into both of the types of potential like pathologies that people run into when they deal with statistical information. And that just raises a question about whether like the right way to just consistently talk to people about what's happening is just to tell stories. Just simply telling stories about people's experience with the illness, independently of any of the statistical information, might be the right way to get people's head around the continued seriousness of the problem. Public health officials should be dealing with the data, but if you're talking about a mass, public appeal, you might want to just stick with personal experience. So thanks, I appreciate your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Jeff. It was a wonderful presentation of research design, and I think that's also very interesting for the students who are now in the second semester. Now you understand how you conceptualize or how you work on a question. And we have also people in the audience who work a lot on European asylum, and maybe also we can kind of draw the bridge here, because what you said in the very beginning, that for example, the application of asylum seekers in Atlanta is naturally much lower than in the bordering states, and this counts also for the European Union. We have already two questions that are a bit more aiming towards a general question about political asylum in the US. I will just bundle them for you quickly. So Irina is asking what are the main nationalities for political asylum, right? Like I guess people from South or Latin America are, it's not the same case like political asylum, like than asylum. And Ali wanted to know how, and that's a tricky question, how really political refugees are protected in the US, or what kind of deals are also made, for example, with Saudi Arabia to please the current government. He's aiming to the case of Jamal Khashoggi. Jeff, feel free to go ahead and try to answer these two tricky questions.
Yeah, so let me see if I can get it real quick. This is one of the good things about Zoom talks. Hold on. So if you go to this site, so the Executive Office for where are we? The Executive Office for Immigration Review is the piece of the Department of Justice that is responsible for the administration of the immigration court system. And they have data on affirmative and defensive asylum requests, and by reason. right? So you're asking about like, this would be a claim based on being a member of a particular social group, like a political party. And so they'll have it. The other place to go is something really quick, is this place, Track. So this thing here is at Syracuse University. And what they did is they did a Freedom of Information Act request and just got a ton of information from EOIR and put it into a more manageable context. And so if you're interested in these statistics, you can go there. The other option is there are a bunch of government reports. So if you just Google GAO report, you'll get like a bunch of different tables. And, you know, just for this talk, I pulled down a couple of those just so you could, like when you were looking at the, you know, requests by country, you can get requests by country by type of request. Do the laws of the United States really protect political refugees? Or is the United States government willing at times to sacrifice them for their own interests, as happened with the Saudi opposition journalist Jamal Khashoggi? Yeah, I mean, sure. So I think it's telling, this is a political process. So it's telling that, like, you know, I don't know how you could do it a lot of different ways, but like the process is going to be managed very carefully by the administrative agencies of the United States, not immediately by the courts of justice in the United States, right? So yes, the United States laws do protect refugees. And yes, the US government is willing to make decisions that raise serious questions about human rights protections when the president or the president's agents believe it's in the national security interest of the country.
Okay, great. Ali is nodding, so it's question answered.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We have another question from our PhD candidate, Dani Reches, who is working herself on asylum seeking towards Europe. So Dani, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, like Verena just said, my background is really in Europe. And I do not know that much about policies and discourses in the US, but I wanted to ask you something about the theoretical framework nonetheless. Because there you say that obviously if you have two different arguments, they wouldn't add up, right? Like you said, when you mix the statistics with the narrative, it would actually work out less well for people to relate to it. But have you also looked into literature that talks about how people view these numbers and statistics? Because as researchers, we often think like, okay, if we have statistics, we have facts, and it's easy to convince other people that this is the case and this is a fact. But I understand that when we're talking about large numbers of immigrants who are usually considered to be the other, the foreigner, something maybe to be afraid of, that big numbers, large numbers don't help an argument to help their cause. Because we also have these figures of speech, right? Like floods of immigrants coming in. How do you stop them streaming in, this overwhelming amount of people? Have you considered looking into literature like that when you talk and try to put forward this argument?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a great question. So it's something we've been talking about quite a bit. It happens, I think, in nearly every place. So there's different. So, okay. I would think about it in a couple different ways. So one is some people will see the very large demand for asylum as a threat, and some people will see it as an opportunity to help, right? So one way to think about it is if you could measure, right, the people's pre-existing understandings of the appropriate level of immigration, right, then you would expect to see different effects of these mixing of statistics and stories among these different people. So one of the ways that we've been trying to do that is tapping into, these were proxies for these things. So like general empathy, right? And I can, can I show you the battery of empathy questions? Because it might be like something that would tap into that, or this would speak to your question. So like these are the kinds of questions we're asking people. So this is like a validated psychological scale of empathy. So you're asking self-assessed. So you're asking them, how easy do you find it yourself to put yourself in someone else's shoes? You're good at predicting how someone will feel. This is my favorite one. Other people say, this is my mother's one on the battery. Other people say I'm insensitive, though I don't always see why. So this is sort of tapping into that piece. It is possible, right? So this idea would be like the folks you're thinking about might show up very low on an empathy scale. But it's possible that like the policy view of immigration is not on the same dimension as empathy. It's just something else. And so that's why we're tapping into partisanship, because those things really do highly correlate with views of empathy. But the other thing we do is add like just a straight, question about how many people do you think is appropriate to let into the country. The final thing is, if we find really strong evidence that it's the large number that's doing the work, then, and we don't find, it may be that the different effects we don't find because we just, whatever, this experiment didn't find it, then we would be left with two possible stories, the one you gave and the one that these folks have been thinking about. Is that helpful? Or?
Yeah, it's clearer now, thanks.
Great. I think I will follow up on this before we take another question, because we are now already at the research design. And also when I went through your paper, it maybe goes a bit in the similar direction of what Danny asked. I was thinking about how you kind of measure or deal with the fact that people are also really much influenced, right, by day-to-day politics, so also pictures that they see on TV. So I thought, like, especially with the former Trump administration, right, that really portrayed especially Mexican immigrants as a big threat or flooding into the country. If there is something that you can, like, that you have, that you took it under consideration, or how you would kind of integrate it in your study, because I think it really matters also what people see day to day on TV, right?
Yeah, again, the way it will work, so it's not, so theoretically, that's a very interesting question. So what the extent to which the words that we use to frame immigration affect people's perceptions of immigration. There's no question. So we use words like bulkhead, invasion-oriented words. There's a ton of evidence, and I think maybe this is partly what Donnie's getting at. There's a ton of evidence that this has a very strong effect on people's opinions. We're not denying that. So what I'm thinking, so this is like a separate question, right? That's a problem. This is another one. And so the way I think about it is, how does the problem you're talking about affect our ability to answer the questions we're trying to answer? Respecting that this is an important issue. So like in the final version of the paper, that stuff needs to go in there just in terms of like, here's some other things to think about as people are thinking about this problem. But from a design perspective, setting that aside, so good outcome and bad outcome. The good outcome is that's going to be a part of the background that the subjects in the study will have. The treatments will be randomly assigned. So how people feel, what they've been exposed to, what images they've seen, how they've interpreted them, those will not be correlated with the treatments we're giving them, right? So it won't bias the estimates that we come up with. That's the good side. The bad side is, it's not a problem per se, but it may be that that story that you are telling is so overwhelming, right, that it makes it basically very, very hard without getting control over it to see the effects that we're seeing. So that, you could start thinking about having different arms of the study where you expose them to different images and then do this study and others that don't get those images, right? Or expose them, prime them to see like really good images of people from Mexico, right, before they see the study, and then do it. So those are some things I'm thinking about, but it's a great question.
Great, thank you. And we have a question, follow-up question from Irina. Maybe Irina, you unmute yourself and ask your question straightforward.
Yes, I'm really curious to find out if the number of, if you have any statistics or information about the number of Russian refugees, Russian like people from Russia asking for political asylum in the United States. If the number has grown, because I right now have two friends who are right now in San Diego they're actually there for 2 years already because of the pandemics. Their courts were postponed, and they asked for political asylum. And if the number, if you know, maybe if the number of people from Russia seeking for refugees, asylums grows.
I put my email in the chat. If you want to email me afterwards, I don't know the answer. I mean, it stands to reason that I could imagine there have been a relatively recent increase. I don't know the answer, but I can find out and set you up with groups. I mean, I can say like in the visits that we've made to immigration court, you know, I don't think that it's that high, but in terms of whether it's increased, I'm not sure. And it's not a population that is, at least in terms of the conversations that I have with practitioners, it's not like a prominent population, but every time we visit an immigration court, there is some person from some country who has a very unique story that looks very different from everyone else in immigration court, and the system has a very hard time dealing with those individuals.
No, I mean,
I'll give you an example. I mean, sorry, go ahead.
I mean, the people I know, they're from Navalny team, and they surely were prosecuted and persecuted in Russia, and they followed up, so they had no other choice but to leave the country. And I don't know if there is someone who speaks Russian in your team, like people you work with, but right now in Telegram, there are a lot of channels where they explain, like, I personally have this instruction in Russian, just step by step, how to get to America without even having a visa. Right now, thousands of Russians are stuck on the border with Mexico, and they're asking for political asylum, and they get to there via Mexico without even a visa to date.
Yeah. There's, I mean, for what the story is obviously harrowing, and if you, on the U.S. side of the border, they're not much better. So one of the things I'll just reflect for you very briefly is, the other piece of the story, a piece of the story I'm not telling is what happens in federal court. So all along the U.S. border, there are people prosecuted every day for illegal entry. So there's some of the people you're talking about are amassed among the U.S. border. When they get caught by Border Patrol within hours, they'll be potentially within hours at a U.S. federal court, and they will be tried along with 75 people at the same time, right? All, they'll be read their rights, they'll be explained what's happened to them, they'll be given opportunity to offer a defense, and basically convicted and sentenced within like an hour, unless they don't speak either Spanish or English, because they tend to have good translation for those two languages almost always. But if you don't speak those two languages, like lots of other longer detention ensues. So those stories I'm sure you know, but I'm just reflecting. We do see that. So just email me and I'll happy to talk to you.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Irina. We have one question, hand up from Shmuel Yerushalmi. So please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, my name is Shmuel Yerushalmi. Yerushalmi. Okay, my question is next. I want to ask you what exactly you can to say about relation to worker migrants and refugees from different states around the world in Israel. Relation to refugees and migrants from side of Israeli official authorities, courts, law institutions. Very interesting to know your opinion in this subject, in this point. Thanks.
So is the question, what's the relationship? I apologize. Is the relationship between immigration, like authorities and courts? Is that the basic idea?
Yeah. That's my question. Yeah.
I mean, I think this, I'll tell you, 4 years ago, all of my work was outside the United States. For the last 3 years, it's been here, in part because of things that happened in my country that convinced me that I wanted to work more inside my country. So I'm learning a lot about the way it works in my country and less about the way it works other places. So I don't feel comfortable speaking to the broader question. I can say that the system here is very strange. We have an immigration court system that's set up to look like a court. They sort of don't really act like courts, but they have all the trappings. The judges wear robes, there's seals of the country above it, they have gavels that they bang, but almost nothing associated with due process that you'd expect to see in a proper court, you observe in U.S. immigration court. I think it's the appointment of the judges is problematic. The fact that they report to the Attorney General is problematic. There is a massive amount of reform that I think ought to happen here. But to get back to some of the issues that came up before, in fact, where Donnie talked about initially, right? Like, there has to be will in the population to reform this. And this is a problem that has existed in Democratic and Republican administrations. It's not something that Trump invented.
Okay, great. Sorry for making you now the new expert on asylum and immigration law. I also would like to recommend, for further interest, the Minerva Center has very good policy papers and research on this, where you can go into it. I think we come to an end, and Jeff, I really want to thank you for taking your time and sharing this with us. Also sharing your email address, and I think it's a beautiful way to introduce us to the second semester and to give us an idea how to really perform a research question, how to outline a design, and yeah, we hope to see your research conducted soon and a paper on it, and I would be very interested. Thank you for everyone for coming, and I wish you a very good second semester with us. Our next talk will be on European solidarity during COVID, and I invite you to join next Thursday. So have a very good week. For all the Israelis, it's weekend. So thank you so much again.